Okay, in this final video, we're going to talk about some of the functions of the lobes of the cerebral cortex, and then we'll talk about additional structures, the limbic system, and the basal ganglia that hang out sort of within this cerebral cortex and what they do. And this will be the last one for chapter 3. So these lobes are pretty big and often have a number of different functions to them. But here are just some of the functions of the lobes that are going to be important for later in this class. So the occipital lobe, which is in the posterior, the most posterior lobe of your brain, includes your primary visual system. So the signals from your eyes are going to get relayed through your sensory relay, which is the thalamus. Some of those signals are going to go down into the midbrain to the superior colliculus to allow you to react very quickly. But most of those signals are going to end up in the occipital lobe, where we are able to consciously perceive the visual signals that come from the world around us. The parietal lobe, which sits just anterior to the occipital lobe, is going to include your sensory system. Okay? There's a band of structures along the parietal lobe just here, and what's sometimes referred to as the postcentral gyrus, up and down, that allow us to sense touch in different parts of our bodies. And in fact, those parts of the parietal of the postcentral gyrus are matched to different parts of your body. So you have got part of that for your left hand and for your right leg and that sort of thing. Another important role for the parietal lobe is involved in visual attention. So once the visual signals go to your occipital lobe, directing our attention, focusing our attention toward different types of content, the parietal lobe gets involved in that. The temporal lobes behind your temples on the lateral sides of your cerebral cortex are involved in auditory processing. So the signals from your ears go to the thalamus for relay, and they some of those signals make it to the inferior colliculus of the midbrain. But most of those signals are going to end up in the temporal lobes, where we can consciously perceive the auditory signals that we're hearing, the voices and the sounds and the music that we hear in the world. Interestingly, the temporal lobe also processes some complex vision, so recognizing objects, recognizing faces. The visual signals are first processed in the occipital lobe, of course, that's our primary visual system, but then actually recognizing things for what they are, identifying what they are, oftentimes gets involved in the temporal lobes. And then the temporal lobes are also involved in some memory functions. Okay, so a lot going on in the temporal lobes. You should know some of the things that it does, or be able to recognize, from a list, something that does auditory, face recognition, and memory functions. That's going to be the temporal lobe as opposed to the parietal lobe. The frontal lobe then is in the anterior part of the brain, the very front of the brain, which is where it gets its name. The frontal lobe is actually a pretty large lobe that's involved in a lot of different things. The first thing it does right here on the precentral gyrus, just on the other side of the central fissure, whereas the parietal lobe senses sensory signals from your body, the precentral gyrus signals movement of those same structures. So you've got a part of the precentral gyrus in the frontal lobe that moves your right hand, a part that moves your left foot, etc. Beyond just movement, though, as we move more and more anterior, more and more frontal, the processing of the frontal lobe gets more and more complex. So one way to think of this is that it's involved in higher order cognition, so deep thinking, reasoning, decision making, interpretations of the world around us. text comprehension, all of that good stuff. The frontal lobe is going to be necessary. It's not necessarily the only part involved, but it's going to be necessary for us to do that kind of deep, higher order thinking. It's also involved in self-regulation and self-control. Okay. So if you stop yourself from yelling at your partner, right? Or you stop yourself from touching the hot thing, the hot plate that you know is hot, but you want the food on it. That's going to involve some self-regulation, some self-control, emotional control. The frontal lobe gets involved in doing that. And these kinds of things, not the movement necessarily, but the higher order cognition, the self-regulation and control, is one of the reasons why the frontal lobe is quite a bit bigger in humans than it is in some other animals, right? Who don't necessarily need those structures for deep thinking and reasoning and making complex arguments and controlling emotions and that sort of thing. It's not necessarily for all animals, though it seems to be necessary in our society. Last couple structures to talk about here. We've got a set of structures called the limbic system. You don't necessarily need to be able to find these in the picture like this, but just to see where they are relative to the rest of your cerebral cortex. You've got these structures kind of looping around underneath the general structure. A couple of these that you should know. Okay, there's a bunch of them on here, but a couple of these you should know because they'll be relevant later. Are the hippocampus, which is right here, looks a bit like a seahorse, which is where the name comes from. The hippocampus is involved in forming new memories. Okay, you might have heard of the hippocampus being involved in memory. That's true. More specifically, it's involved in forming new explicit memories. Okay, we'll talk about what that means later, but just know that it's involved in these kinds of memories. The amygdala is this almond-shaped structure hanging off the front of the hippocampus right here. The amygdala is involved in emotions, but more specifically, it's involved in fear processing. It does get involved in some other emotional processing, but it seems to be particularly attuned to fear. Finally, and again, you don't necessarily need to be able to draw a picture of these or anything, or know all of them, but you've got these structures that are finding their way around the sides of the thalamus that are oftentimes referred to generally as the basal ganglia. The basal ganglia have a number of structures underneath them. You can see, caudate, putamen, and globus pallidus, and nucleus accumbens. Okay. For now, I just need you to think about the basal ganglia in general. We'll learn about some of these a bit later. There are two main things that I want you to know about the basal ganglia at this point. Number one is that the basal ganglia is also involved in regulating voluntary movement and decision making. It also regulates your dopamine pathways. Dopamine pathways are important for processing rewards and for regulating behaviors. Okay, and so based on the fact that it is involved in dopamine pathways, that it regulates movements, decision making, reward processing, right? When you make a decision, you're looking for a reward out of that decision, right? As well, there are a couple clinical notes that are relevant for later. So Parkinson's disease, for example, oftentimes involves degeneration of dopamine neurons, many of which are in or connect to the basal ganglia. So as the neurons in this dopamine system degenerate through Parkinson's disease, our ability to regulate our voluntary movement declines. Okay? Which is why as people develop Parkinson's disease, as that progresses, their movement abilities become more difficult. It becomes more difficult to start moving or to coordinate movement. Okay? The basal ganglia Nucleus accumbens in particular, but the basal ganglia in general, is also going to be involved in addiction processing. So, as those dopamine pathways are activated through addictive substances, for example, or addictive behaviors, right? These dopamine pathways are going to be involved in that process. So, these will be relevant for later in the semester.